Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Collaborative Edges, conversations to inspire initiatives across languages and cultures. I'm Rocío Quispeañoli, the host of Collaborative Edges. Today, February 16, 2018, the symposium Migration Studies and the Humanist Perspective has taken place at Michigan State University. And for this edition of our podcast series, we have in the studio the symposium guest speakers. Evelyn Al-Sultani, Director of the Arab and Muslim American Studies Program at the University of Michigan, Madeleine Hron, Associate Professor of English and Film Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada, and Ana Celia Centella, Professor Emerita in the Ethnic Studies Department at University of California, San Diego. We also have Professor Miguel Cabañas, Professor of Spanish at Michigan State University, and the organizer of the symposium. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you.
How are you?
Okay, let's start with a conversation with the first question for Miguel. Could you tell us the goals of this symposium and when and how you started working on it? Who's sponsoring this initiative?
Well, we started working on it when there was a call for submissions of collaborative new initiatives put out by the College of Arts and Letters at MSU. And we, out of a conversation with another colleague, we thought that we needed to start conversations about migration studies at a moment where migration studies are always on the news. And, you know, many times you only hear economists or political scientists or sociologists talking about it, and yet we don't have the perspective of the humanities. And we thought that it was important to start these conversations, create the space, and start talking about these issues and, you know, try to develop a strategy to get our stories out there. So we started working about a year ago, and we decided to invite the speakers that are here with us, and also to involve graduate students and faculty from MSU to talk about these issues.
Thank you very much, Miguel, for this brief presentation. I would like to ask you now to continue the conversation with the guest speakers.
Yeah, it's been a great day for the conference, and you know, I would like to ask you, why is it so important today to talk about migration?
Well, I guess I'll start because my presentation was the most global perspective of all of them, that because it deals with refugee issues. And, well, there's 65 million new displaced people every year. So that's the highest since World War II. So it's increasingly our larger problem in our global world, and it's the way that you deal with issues dealing from civil war to climate change now is people move. People cannot stay in their home countries, and what are you going to do with these people? Are you going to welcome them? Are you going to stick them in camps? Are you going to subject them to lengthy asylum claims and processes? Are you going to force them to move somewhere else? So I think this issue is certainly not going to go away. It's only going to get worse in the current climate because we really don't have any solutions for it right now in a political perspective.
Thank you, Madeline. And Ana Celia Centella, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I was very happy to participate in this conversation today, especially because we are now confronting such high levels of intolerance in the United States, and this triggers physical violence and other ways of erasing people's identities. And I think we're losing the opportunity to learn from the groups and to understand how we can, in fact, open our minds and experiences to allow for a greater enrichment. I particularly am interested in the erasure of languages, not only in families that no longer teach their children their home language because they fear that that would be an impediment to their progress, but also the general displacement of attitudes towards people's different accents, et cetera. And I think that it's not a coincidence that in the first 10 days of the Trump administration, the Southern Poverty Law Center found more than 800 cases of hate crimes that were documented, and that we're looking at an uptake in this. I think it's important for us to be able to disaggregate the experiences of the newcomers from those Italians and Irish and Germans who have been here for more generations and many other groups. I think we need to talk with them across those borders. I think we also need to look at the different Latino subgroups and not confuse the Salvadoran or the Cuban experience with the Puerto Rican or the Mexican experience. And I'm concerned about our lack of reaching out to African American communities for us to be able to discuss what unites us and what are the problems that we need to address together.
Thank you. And Evelyn, I'm sure you have some thoughts, and you talk about hate crimes and the issues with that.
Yes. So migration studies is very important to address today. But as an American Studies scholar, I would say that it's always been important to address when considering the history of this country, particularly since Native Americans are the true Americans, and therefore studying the history of the United States requires studying immigration and people from all over the world. And there have always been debates about who's a real American, and those debates continue. So long ago, there were debates around who belonged here based on whiteness, since whiteness was a prerequisite to be a citizen before 1952, and those kinds of debates still continue today in terms of whether Muslims are considered to be Americans, whether undocumented immigrants can be considered Americans, and I think that the conference today really highlighted all of those kinds of issues. Regarding my own presentation about hate crimes, my hope is to try to think through cases in which Muslim youth are victims of hate crime, but when their cases are not labeled as hate crimes, but as parking disputes and as road rage. And I was trying to think through how we can think about hate crimes differently if we were to think about violence against Arab and Muslim communities, not only through hate crimes, but also through state violence, for example, through the Patriot Act, through U.S. wars in Muslim countries, through countering violent extremism, and of course, through the quote-unquote Muslim ban.
Yeah, thank you. And is there a specific humanist perspective? Is there a different way of looking at things, or is just something that, basically all our work is interdisciplinary in quality, but what is the humanist perspective?
Well, as for me in my work on refugees, refugees are easily reduced to statistics. They're really easily dismissed as very distant others. And I think that a humanities perspective really brings to light their lived experience, their reality, their humanity. And it forces, especially since I work on film and narrative, to think through these issues with some form of empathy or maybe even vicariously living through their experience with them. And this kind of shared experience, I think, promotes a different type of understanding than just a bunch of numbers, right? I think scientists have shown that we really don't have the capacity to understand the experience of more than actually two people. So as soon as statistics go up to 3, we're lost. So talking about 65 million people, that's way beyond our understanding. So I think that for me, the humanities really brings that out and really asks us to relate to our emotions as well, and how, let's say, emotions such as sympathy operate, or indifference, as well as emotions that are less pleasant, such as fear or maybe anger or indignation, and how these shape our images or understandings of refugees and immigrants in this country and all around the world, and really helping us kind of maybe also see different truths that are not always represented in the media and accessible to us in other ways through statistics or public policy or rhetoric around us every day. Yeah.
Centella?
Well, I was very touched by the poem that you read, Daniel, by this young undocumented youth who came on his own at age 9, Javier Zamora.
Yeah.
And the extent to which, and how he said that he had to write it in a poem because he would not be able to deal with such powerful and painful memories in any other form. So I think the humanities allows us to rethink these experiences and communicate them in different ways that reach people in more personal ways. The other thing that I was very touched by was the moment in which Professor Hassan talks about his family going to, of all places, Sioux Falls, from Lebanon
South
in
Dakota.
the 1800s. And the tears that brought up on several occasions as he was making his presentation. And my own, experience as the daughter of a Mexican immigrant and a Puerto Rican, and those different colonial and neo-colonial situations that caused them to come here. I think the personal and the political get very much better addressed when you have a very broad humanist approach to these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
So as I mentioned in my presentation, I think that the importance of humanist perspectives is in helping us think beyond the terms of the debate as given to us by government or by the media. So, for example, within Muslim American studies, we often talk about a good-bad Muslim dichotomy, which basically means that after 9/11, Mahmoud Mamdani wrote about this in his book, that the response to the idea that Muslims are terrorists is the quote-unquote good Muslim. And this is someone who is patriotic, who's willing to give their life and fight and die for the United States, who supports government policies, and it promotes a very limited view of patriotism. We can think about Khizr Khan at the Democratic National Convention as the ultimate good Muslim who has literally given his son's life. He's lost his son, and he really came to symbolize the good Muslim in America. But the humanist perspective says, is this really the answer? Is the answer to the quote-unquote bad Muslim the good Muslim? What are the limits? How can we think beyond this? How can we think about how this is putting unreasonable expectations on human beings? So I see the humanist perspective as being really important to helping us think beyond the terms of a debate as they are given to us and seeing alternative ways to think about pressing social and political issues of our time.
Yeah, I think that's very important, especially, when we talk about language, when we talk about issues of, political and also human rights, in a way that, we need to change. In a way, we need to disrupt the discourse. We need to talk about it in a different way. And I think, we don't hear enough from this perspective. I think, it's not present in our media.
Yeah.
And, if we are able to educate people, to spread these ideas, I think it would be useful for at least people would be able to contrast them with what they're being fed in corporate media in some ways. But what do we do? How do we do that? can we do that? Can we take corporate media on?
I think one of the jobs as scholars in the humanities is to highlight and make known the logics that legitimize exclusion. That oftentimes they go unrecognized, they go unnoticed, they become so normalized. So I think part of the process is exposing it and making it known and becoming aware of how that operates, I think, is an important first step.
And that is something that literary scholars or people working with languages and text can do very well. Point out the things that are obvious, but I'm sorry.
No, Rocio, I agree, and I think this is why I talk about the racialization aspects of language and the ways in which language has been remapped from biology, and racism has been remapped from biology onto language because it's no longer politically acceptable to talk about people's skin color or their shape of their eyes or their hair, types of hair. But it is very acceptable to make very demeaning comments about the languages that people speak or the way they speak English. And what we have done is talk about race indirectly by attacking language, which in fact ends up being counterproductive. It is what it's going to in fact make families less cohesive and create greater distance in the community when children can no longer speak to their grandparents. And when I have my niece listen to their father on tape, and he's talking Spanish, and they don't know what he's saying. Right. And they realize they have missed half of this man's life.
Yeah. And they can never go back. Painful. And they can never go back to that. And I think it's very powerful what you're saying. And I think, many people live that every day. Speak English, we're in the United States, or speak American, which I don't know what American is, American is not a language, obviously, but I think that is really an important lesson, because people do that it's being naturalized, but they don't, not necessarily people understand that the connotations of that. Mm-hmm. And how about you, Madeline? What do you think?
Well, I think that my work with images kind of shows that maybe we also have to learn to see new forms of images and ways to interrupt these images. For example, I talked about a film by a Chinese dissident called Ai Weiwei, who's taken up the cause of refugees. And one of the things that he does is he disrupts very stereotypical images that we have about refugees by giving new ones. For example, there's the famous image of Alan Kurdi on the beach, this small toddler. And so what Ai Weiwei has done, he has taken, for example, himself and on the beach. So kind of showing that anybody could be a refugee, or why is it that we suddenly privilege the position of small children, and why do we just care about babies being killed? What about adults, or just kind of making people think. And I think that that's are really giving the forum to these creative people like artists and filmmakers and writers really helps us to see creative ways to dismantle the negative stereotypes and the negative media portrayal around us. I think that, one of the things that makes me sad is that, the xenophobes around us are constantly spewing the same kind of language, the same kind of repetitive hate rhetoric. But in a way, it's of comfort to me, or it gives me some hope, because I hope that, we can interrupt that discourse with new imagery or new ways of creative ways of disrupting that discourse that engages people and makes them think and makes them move away from these same ways of thinking that they've heard all the time. So I really find that it gives me a lot of optimism in that way.
That's great. Some films, though, they kind of portray things in a kind of mythological way, the myths of the the migrant who makes it, etc.
Oh, sure.
Or the refugee,
There's
the
a lot
happy
of-
refugee, or the that kind of stuff. And I was wondering, when we talk about documentaries, is documentary films are disrupting that narrative? Are they, or are we, do we need to try to make new narratives that reach more people? Because documentary film sometimes doesn't reach a lot of a big audience, but other kinds of films, and how can we
Yeah, and that's why I think Ai Weiwei's film is so powerful, because for the first time a filmmaker has been given a lot of money. I mean, he's not disclosed how much money he's had, but he traveled to 23 countries, visited 40 camps, had 900 hours of footage, 600 interviews. I mean, this guy had oodles of money that a normal documentarian would never dream of. So he's able to do some really neat things, like shots with drones and just a lot of neat stuff. And I think that, I don't know. I don't want to play the game. As a film scholar, I cannot play the game of what's better, a documentary or a narrative film. I think that there's value in both, and I think that a successful filmmaker will also take up and use stereotypes in a way to appeal to people's emotions. I mean, as I mentioned slightly, the sentimentalization of the child, yes, that's a stereotype, but why not use pathos to engage people's emotions? I mean, we talked about Hassan's emotional response to his grandmother, and definitely that was emotion affected us all. And I think that emotion is going to help us transform our maybe rational or irrational thinking about other people. Yeah. So I think that, I don't think that there's, I'm not going to give the secret formula away about how to make a successful film. Please contact me, and I will sell that for $1 million.
I have a formula.
Okay.
So
giving it away for free.
And I will.
The humanist you are.
So I wrote a book on representations of Arabs and Muslims in the media after 9/11. And what I found is that there's an increase in quote-unquote positive representations, where there are many more patriotic Arab and Muslim Americans represented. And the larger context is that Jack Shaheen wrote a book called Real Bad Arabs, where he looks at 1,000 movies, Hollywood movies, and how they represent Arabs. And he says that out of the 1,000 that he looks at, he would characterize 52 as even-handed and 12 as positive. So there's a huge history of distorting the image of Arabs and Muslims. And people often ask me, what's the solution? And I feel like the solution isn't, don't represent them as terrorists anymore, but we need more stories. Right. That if there are 1,000 negative portrayals, we need 1,000 varied ones. Right. And that's ultimately the answer. That there's so many stories that the stereotype of the terrorist is not the only one that sticks.
Right. And what I wanted to add is the extent to which each of us needs to help disseminate these stories and go out for them. We can't wait for the $2 million that Wei had to make it, or
maybe more,
probably more. But I cite Bourdieu and this notion that we are all complicit unless we challenge authority. It would not continue to function if it didn't have our complicit acceptance. And that means speaking to neighbors, getting involved in local community activities, giving library talks, speaking mainly to the groups and letting them produce their own videos, handing out cameras to young people, getting those impressions in their raps, in their poetry, and in letters home, and see what comes from their own experience.
Yeah. And the empowerment that brings.
Yes. And I must say that one of the things that really inspired me today was listening to the graduate students who were speaking, because I really feel like they had a lot of gifts. For example, Jose talking about his experience as a DACA recipient was really empowering to see how he's challenged and overcome all the stereotypes that he's been given, or that Hima is able to navigate both in the Nepalese and the Bhutanese communities to create some form of reconciliation just through her work. I don't think she realizes, or Jose realizes, how inspiring that is and how positive it is. So, I don't think that we're the people you should be talking to. I think you should have been talking to the graduate students because they're the future, really.
They are.
Miguel, would you like to ask our last question about advice?
Yes, I would like you to ask. I would like to ask you, what advice would you give to students and young scholars who are interested in studying migration?
I would very much encourage them to join us. The more, the merrier. There are so many problems that need a humanist perspective, and so I would very much encourage them. Of course, law school is important and med school is important, but there are other things worth considering that are also important in terms of helping us solve very pressing social and political issues.
Yes. And Celia?
I think you have to be passionate about what you're going to study because there's a lot of boring stuff that you have to go through. So I would urge people to look around and pick something that really matters to them and hopefully to a larger community, and say, this is what I'm going to write about in a way that reaches more than 10 academics who will read that paper. And I ask graduate students and faculty members to ask their students, undergraduates and graduates, to write papers that are written for the community, to publish them and put them online and go on YouTube and produce things. I had students in San Diego and students in Swarthmore produce volumes on language issues in those local communities written by students who went out to communities.
That's wonderful.
And I would urge people to go out into the communities and start their work there.
That is wonderful.
And I would also tell students not to become despairing or despondent. I think there's a lot of negative depictions out there, a lot of problems out there, but I think that they can change the world. As a student, I saw the Berlin Wall fall. I saw communism fall. I saw apartheid fall. I saw presidents, I saw previous political prisoners become presidents. So it's completely possible, and I think that students are the ones who are going to be making the change in this world, and to look with optimism to creative solutions and to activism as means of hope and sources even of joy.
Okay, well,
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'd like to conclude this conversation thanking our guests today, Evelyn, Ana Celia, Madeleine, and Miguel, and invite you to visit the website of the symposium at migrations.web.cal.msu.edu for more information about the event as well as for our guests. And finally, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Letters, any of our sponsors, or any official entities of Michigan State University. I also want to thank our technical producer, Daniel Trego. Tune in for our next podcast.